Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I am Diana Sorenson. I'm the Dean for Arts and Humanities, and my office has collaborated with the Creative Writing Program in the English department, with the Office for the Arts, with Greg Harris, and several others in organizing this wonderful inaugural Literary Arts Festival, and I'm delighted to see so many of you here. This evening, the event is focused on writing at Harvard. Not all our writers will be reading, but we have a wonderful group of them, and I myself am very keen to sit down and enjoy the power of language. I will turn this over to the director of the Creative Writing Program, Bret Johnston, and I want to take this opportunity to say a few things about Bret's career. So, Bret is a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop. He has written for the Atlantic Monthly, the Paris Review, the New York Times Magazine. He's in a whole array of anthologies, such as the Best American Short Stories. His Corpus Christi stories, published in 2004, was named a Best Book of the Year by the London Independent and by the Irish Times. He also edited Naming the World and other exercises for the creative writer. And this very month of May, we're eagerly awaiting the release of his novel, Remember Me Like This. And it's already a Barnes & Noble Discover Great New Writers selection. Tonight, I have the very, very special pleasure of announcing a wonderful gift to the Creative Writing Program at Harvard that will honor Bret Johnston. He will become the Paul and Catherine Buttenwieser Director of the Creative Writing Program. And it is a very well-deserved honor for Bret, who's led the program brilliantly, and it also signals our desire to keep growing and developing creative writing at Harvard. And all of you show how central an interest this is. So I'm happy to congratulate Bret and to signal this important moment in creative writing. So here's to you, Bret. Now over to you.
Thank you, Diana and everyone. I just want Diana to narrate my life. I mean, I anything she would say about me, and I'm sure she said many less kind things about me, I think it would still sound good with the way that she talks. Obviously, this is a very nice thing that's happened, not just for me, but for creative writing. So I want to thank you all for being here, and I certainly want to thank Diana for everything that she said. There's no way to overestimate the influence that Harvard has had on the world of letters. From T.S. Eliot to Jamaica Kincaid, from E.E. Cummings to Jorie Graham, from John Cheever to Margaret Atwood to Amy Hempel, from Seamus Heaney to, well, Seamus Heaney. The writers who have spent time here have changed not just what we read, but how we read. There is no genre or form that our faculty and students have not made their own and made more rewarding for the audience. Whether playwriting or prose, poetry or screenwriting, the work that Harvard writers have made is as unparalleled in its breadth and depth as it is in its power, its beauty, its reach, and resonance. We're here tonight to celebrate the making of literary art at Harvard University. And by celebrating its faculty and its students, we're celebrating the university's longstanding confidence in and commitment to the imagination made manifest on the page. We're celebrating a university that refuses to see creative writing as an indulgence. As evidenced by the inaugural LITFest that we're experiencing right now and this year's recipient of the Harvard Arts Medal, as evidenced by the ongoing evolution and expansion of the creative writing program, as evidenced by the literary magazines, the nearly nightly author readings, and the Harvard Playwriting Festival, as evidenced by the generosity of donors like Paul and Catherine Buttonwieser and all those who will surely follow their exemplary lead. The university clearly sees creative writing as the opposite of indulgence. We're fortunate to write in an institution where literary art is regarded with the same seriousness as the sciences. And much like the practice of science, to write is to take part in the sacred act of witness. And to bear witness to the profound is to humble yourself and risk the kind of vulnerability that is both terrifying and liberating, both necessary and very likely the most difficult thing you will ever choose to do. The extraordinary faculty reading tonight and those who couldn't be here to read with us tonight, those who are here who are not able to read with us tonight, don't aim to make that difficulty any easier, but rather we try to prepare our students for the challenge, a challenge that might well be called a lifetime of yearning. Yearning for more precise imagery, for clearer language, for lines and stanzas that will change your readers the way you have been changed. Henry James said that every writer is a reader moved to emulation, and each of us up here tonight has seen the twin identities of reader and writer within our students' work. In workshop and in the university at large, we honor the co-creation of literary art, that space where reader meets writer, and we invite our students to take the formal, imaginative, and emotional risks that result in transcendent work. We have faith that they will not write for us, but in spite of us. And we consider it a privilege to hold them to the high standards of the literature that brought them here. Our workshops are fundamentally an invitation. We invite our students to take themselves seriously as writers, and they invite us to read their work through the lens of its own creation. The work invites our attention and admiration, and the success of each student invites our renewed devotion to the privilege and responsibility of what we do. It's an honor to accept these rare invitations, and it's an honor to extend them. As writers, professors, and as readers move to emulation not just by the work that has come before us, but by the work that is being done now, by the promise of the work that will be done. So now we invite you to listen to short readings and at least one screening of our own work. After that, we'll discuss the creative writing program, our teaching and experience as writers, and just about anything else that relates to the writing life that you're interested in. We do not invite you to workshop us. We don't want to know what isn't working in what we read tonight. This is not your chance for revenge. You have your Q scores for that. So what I'll do is I'll introduce everyone now, then I'll do a very short reading of my own so that I don't have to follow my far more talented colleagues. Before all of that, I hope you'll help me thank everyone one last time who put together LITFest, including, but not at all limited to, Greg Harris, whose idea this was in the first place, Dean Sorenson and Sarah and everyone in her office, Jack Megan in the Office of the Arts, all of the student producers, the English department, and of course all of you for coming tonight and for all of your writing. Thank you very much. I kind of feel like we didn't know exactly how this was going to be set up, but I feel like we have the one opportunity in the life of our writers is that I could call you, I could read your bios, and I could, and then you could like come and take a seat. It would be very like talk show like, right? I wish we had a band. Josh Bell is the Briggs Copeland Lecturer in English and Poetry. He has an MFA from the University of Iowa and wow. No, I just, I didn't know we were going to do it in the middle of the bio. But no, it's great. It's great. And a PhD in the University of Cincinnati. He's the author of No Planet Strike and has recently published poems in the New Republic, Tin House, and the Boston Review. Darcy Frey is a Briggs Copeland Lecturer on Nonfiction and is best known for his...
Thank you very much.
Is best known for his impeccable timing and his wonderful book, The Last Shot, City Streets, Basketball Dreams. Frey has published articles in the Rolling Stone, Harper's, and the New York Times Magazine. He was a contributing editor at Harper's and the New York Times Magazine and the winner of a National Magazine Award and the Livingston Award. Amy Hempel has published 5 acclaimed collections of short stories, including The Collected Stories of Amy Hempel, which was named one of the 10 best books. Show and tell, perfect. 10 best books of the year by the New York Times. She has won an award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. She has received a Guggenheim Fellowship and an inaugural fellowship from the United States Artists Foundation. And as many of you know, she has a wonderful, wonderful dog named Juanita. Would you believe that we've rehearsed this whole thing like 10 times?
Go with the band.
Sam Marks is the Briggs Copeland Lecturer on Playwriting. His most recent play, The Delling Shore, had a world premiere at the 2013 Humana Festival. Other productions include The Old Masters at Steppenwolf's First Look, The Joke at Studio Dante, and Nelson with Partial Comfort Productions. Sam's plays have been workshopped and read at The Atlantic, the Sundance Theater Institute, The Vineyard, and many others. He is currently developing a project at HBO produced by Steve Buscemi and Stanley Tucci. Sam has 2 very good-looking children. It's true.
It's true.
Mark Jude Poirier is the author of 2 collections of short stories, 2 novels, and several screenplays, including Hateship, Love Ship, an adaptation of an Alice Munro story which is currently in release and stars Kristen Wiig. His films have screened at Sundance, the Toronto International Film Festival, the Nantucket Film Festival, and the American Film Festival. Next year, Scribner will publish Intro to Alien Invasion, a graphic novel he wrote with Owen King and Nancy Ahn. He's the Briggs Copeland Lecturer in Screenwriting. Mark has very green pants. So I am going to read a whopping 2 paragraphs from the novel that Deanna was kind enough to mention. It's called Remember Me Like This. It comes out in 2 weeks from yesterday. I feel like, we've already shared so much tonight that I think we can call it even if everybody in this room just buys 5 copies. There's no way that I mean, it's not going to do any of us any good for me to give you any context. But maybe these 2 paragraphs, which happen at opposite ends of the book, maybe they would give you some sense of, maybe actually as I'm saying this, maybe what they do is ensure that you'll never buy the book, because you know basically how it starts and how it ends. It's a real worthless idea. So this is very early in the book. In the first days after giving birth, a mother dolphin whistles continuously. She breaches the surface to draw breath, then submerges and lets the air pass through the nasal sacs around her blowhole. Initially, the sound is uniform, like air slipping from a balloon, but soon the mother will modulate the whistle's pitch and pattern, gradually curling it into a unique shape, an acoustic signature that the calf can recognize and repeat. It's her name. She'll make no other sound until the calf understands how to identify her whistle in dark water, how to call for her if they're ever separated. Once the mother's signature is learned, she will alter the whistle again and name the calf. The younger dolphin's early attempts at its own signature will be faint and quivering, but within a year the whistle will grow elegant, assured, strong. The signature never changes. For the rest of its life, the dolphin and any others who learn its name will infuse the whistle with meaning, layer the contours of sound with awareness and history and the intricate longing for company. Then about 400 pages later. Imagine killing a man, the commitment, the irreversible and unspeakable isolation in its wake, how you'd have to relinquish yourself, the entirety of the life that had come before and the dreamed for future, knowing that nothing and no one would remain the same afterward. How, by killing him, you'd also be killing yourself, and what would follow would be a hollow, two-planed existence. Both true, both false. You would have come to see the world as an animal does, without judgment or hope or mercy, and believe that nothing, not grace or history, not consequence or shame or God, mattered more than what you longed to protect. Imagine how it would feel like surrender, like a homecoming aborted, like a narrative without end. Thanks.
I'm just going to read a couple short poems that I think of as connected to Harvard. I wrote them both here. One of them, the first one, was published in the Harvard Advocate. I was happy to have it published in the Harvard Advocate. And I wrote this one based out of lessons that I've done in the intermediate class. I have students write an ekphrastic poem, which is a poem that's just connected to another work of art. And in my fall intermediate class, they wrote those poems so well that I wanted to try to write and see if I could compete with them. So this is a poem called Dollar Dollar Bill, which will probably connect to the Wu-Tang Clan song. Oh, good, thank you. Dollar Dollar Bill. One more Jacobean kiss, and you'll wind up related to me. One more emotion, and I'm coming for you like a sparrow. Set your phenomenology on the windowsill. Filthy, meet family. Family, I want to get marketable again. In the meantime, what are your thoughts on a completely male garden? As little closure, maybe, as there is a permanence. This being also the time of the wandering Miss Americas. Loose thumb bones rattling in a mint tin. One more emotion and both Dakotas will explode. One more condition and I'll be exiting my relevance. And what was it finally so dead about him, family? I think I just saw a fox. Yes, with its little foxen teeth like Ezekiel's. Of course, you were off busy, revising your plague journals, bringing clock to the beltline of Orion. What could have you done about the remaining days no longer outnumbering us? Voice of the dying groupie, like a deck of cards being shuffled. One last electromagnetic pulse. One last electromagnetic pulse, and the neutral bodies of the dead dropping from our larger living bodies. The truth? I thought the castration threat a touch on the heavy side of the tonality, but you got your point across. And by then, we were a much cleaner people anyway. And also in that same intermediate class, I asked students to sometimes think about their voice, even if it's a confessional voice, if they're writing from their own personal experience, to think of it as a character or a character on stage. So I sometimes would have them individually write origin stories for their voice. And so I decided also to write one for mine. And this is called Where the I Comes From, the pronoun I. Where the I comes from. Our days often ended and began with the sound of voices raised in song, even after we murdered our friends and neighbors, even after we brought the attention of our knives to the neighbors of our neighbors until at last the neighborhoods fell silent and the cities quiet and the city's city, the country then and next the country, until finally the moon, as if its own reflection, looked upon an earth that we had emptied nearly back to Eden. Even then, in that silence which seemed almost a silence, sadly, we were not alone. All we ever wanted was to be alone, to visit no one, to be visited by nothing. But even after we'd traveled to the nearby planets and relieved them of their voices, even after, and we all knew this was coming, we fell amongst each other, brother and sister, until only I survived. Still I heard it, the universe subtracted of its skin and hair, and yet the sound of a voice, like someone singing in the hold of a sinking ship, unbidden and irrelevant, a fathom and a fathom deep, but never fading. Thanks.
Hi. I've been working on a book about sort of a renegade scientist who does ornithological seabird research up in the Alaskan Arctic. His name is George DeVokie, and he's got a field camp up in just north of Barrow, Alaska, and I spent about 3 summers with him there, and in the course of reporting this nonfiction book, George DeVokie and I traveled across the Western Arctic and the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and down into Antarctica, and the book that I'm writing about him is I suppose it's part narrative journalism, part science story, and part a travel book. So in the first chapter of the book, I introduce the reader to the scientist George DeVokie and his ornithological obsession. And in the second chapter, I introduce the reader to the second figure in the book, which is the narrator, which is me. And I thought I would just read a couple of pages from the second chapter. When I was a boy, I never thought of the Arctic without calling to mind an atlas-sized book on polar exploration that my father liked to pull off his shelf, and the slight wheeze from his emphysema that sang in my ear when I sat on his lap to look at it. Together we read of towering figures, gods among men, we agreed, who'd risked their very lives exploring the great white voids. There was granite-jawed Shackleton, who never lost a man after his ship was split to splinters in the crushing Antarctic ice, and Admiral Byrd, so dashing in his fur-trimmed hood, even after he was heaved, delirious from carbon monoxide poisoning from a subterranean shack in the Great Ross Ice Barrier, and most fearless of all, Sir Robert Falcon Scott, with his fierce mustache and epaulets a-glitter, just before he set off on his doomed South Pole expedition. In a voice trembling with gravitas, my father would read from the letters Scott kept feebly scratching out, even as a blizzard raged outside his wind-blasted tent, turning his blood to ice. My dear Barry, we are pegged out in a very comfortless spot. I write a word of farewell. We are showing that Englishmen can still die with a bold spirit, fighting it out to the end. I may not have proved a great explorer, but we have done the greatest march ever and come very near to great success. Goodbye, my dear friend. The illustrated history of polar exploration also contained a collection of antiquarian maps, facsimiles of the earliest cartographic efforts to chart the Arctic. Mystified medieval mapmakers rendered it as nothing but an icy expanse, providing habitat to spiny-backed sea monsters and fierce dragons breathing undulated ribbons of fire. In 1607, when Henry Hudson sailed for the North Pole, he followed maps indicating that he was heading for a massive boulder of black basalt sitting in the middle of a warm, calm sea. Even in the 19th century, the Arctic remained a blank slate, a tabula rasa, my father enunciated, upon which travelers projected their most potent desires and fears. Seasoned explorers trekking across that flat, ice-covered ocean kept insisting upon the existence of distant palisades and high, grayish ramparts shimmering in the cold, clear air that could never be found. Science would later provide an explanation for these misperceptions, along with a hypnotic Latin name that I love to say out loud, the Fata Morgana mirage, an optic phenomenon in which reflections off of water, snow, and ice created visions of mountain ranges and urban skylines where there was nothing but empty sky. But I was never quite convinced that those leathery men with their missing toes and the sharp taste of sled dog in their mouths hadn't seen just what they'd seen. The Arctic, that enigmatic expanse of snow and ice, of ancient peoples and unspeakably hostile temperatures, seemed a fantastical place where anything could happen. In 1897, an unnamed Swedish balloonist, my father and I called him Olaf, disappeared while trying to float his way to the North Pole, and his friends, convinced that he was hiding out in some high-latitude Shangri-La, waited 30 years for him to quit his hammock and come strolling out of the balmy Arctic seas. "Do you think Olaf ever made it?" I asked, turning anxiously to my father. "I believe he did," he replied with a wink, "and with a suntan too," he added with a squeak of his failing lungs. My mother was from Canada. Though she moved to New York at 18, she never announced her citizenship, and I shared her pride of place. I hung a Canadian flag over my bed and practiced the tight-voweled accents of my cousins from Toronto. Spreading maps of Canada on my floor, I searched the empty expanses that began just north of the U.S. border, where the cities and roads gave out and the country vaulted upwards for more than 2,000 miles through endless mountains, lakes, and rivers until the land seemed to shatter into hundreds of island floes, floating amid the stiff gray chop of the Arctic Ocean. Glenn Gould, the reclusive and mystical Canadian pianist, once put together a radio documentary for the CBC called The Idea of North. He traveled across Arctic Canada with a portable mic and a reel-to-reel recorder to capture the region's sounds. The clickety-clack of steam-powered trains chuffing across the taiga and the clipped, consonant-heavy accents of the Inuit from Baffin Island to the Mackenzie Delta, the gunshot crack of a frozen lake in winter, and the upward yodeling of old squaw geese set against a silence so vast you could almost hear the curve of the earth. Gould, who loved Bach's contrapuntal compositions, took the voices he recorded and mixed them into his own kind of fugue. The men and women he talked to spoke of the beauty and harshness of a land made up of thin margins, of how the North teaches you to learn by looking and soak up botany through the soles of your feet, of how the isolation of living in a village 1,000 miles from nowhere and a couple of weeks from the next plane out pushes you up against yourself, and if you don't crack up, helps you see both your own reliance on your neighbors and the strength of your own character. Lying in bed with my headphones, I listened to The Idea of North again and again, experiencing sound bloom into image, the vast green ocean of tundra, the faint hologrammatic dance of the aurora borealis, the undisturbed surface of a lake suddenly rippling from the explosive liftoff of a flock of long-tailed ducks. And if I kept my eyes closed, I could picture myself setting off by dog sled from the tip of Ellesmere Island, my back to the known world, nothing ahead but the vast, uninterrupted ice sheet stretching northward to the pole. Thank you.
My students know that I'm really keen on the short story. I'm keen to read them, love writing them. I'm going to read 2 stories, but I will come in under my allotted time, no fear. I'll start with the shortest story. I can get to it here. Shortest story I've ever written. It's also the truest story I've ever written. Hang on. It's called Memoir. Just once in my life. Oh, when have I ever wanted anything just once in my life? And for my next story, when I was a writing student, I was urged, if not commanded, to
to write from the point of the most jeopardy to myself. That I often took that to mean. And after doing that for some time, I thought, well, what if I wrote from the point of the most contentment, happiness even? What would that look like? And this is what it came to look like. This is a story called Weekend. The game was called on account of dogs. Hunter in the infield, Tucker in the infield, Bosco and Boone at first base. First grader Donald sat down on second base, and Kirsten grabbed her brother's arm and wouldn't let him leave third to make his first run. On fair, her brother screamed, and the dogs, roving umpires, ran to third. Good power, their uncle yelled when Joy, in a leg cast, swung the bat and missed. Now put some wood to it. And when she did, Joy's designated runner, cousin Zeke, ran to first, the ice cubes in his gin and tonic clacking like dog tags in the glass. And when Kelly broke free from Kirsten and this time came in to make the run, members of the Kelly team made Tucker in the infield dance on his hind legs. It's not who wins, their coach began, and was shouted down by one of the boys. There's first and there's forget it. Then Hunter retrieved a foul ball and carried it off in the direction of the river. The other dogs followed, barking, mutinous. Dinner was a simple picnic on the porch, paper plates in laps, the only conversation a debate as to which was the better grip for throwing shoes. After dinner, the horseshoes were handed out, the post pounded in, the rules reviewed, with the new rule added due to falling down shorts. The new rule, have a tire. The women smoked on the porch, the smoke repelling mosquitoes, and the men and children played on even after dusk when it got so dark that a candle was rigged to balance on top of the post and was knocked off and blown out by every single almost ringer. Then the children went to bed, or at least went upstairs, and the men joined the women for a cigarette on the porch, absently picking ticks engorged like grapes off the sleeping dogs. And when the men kissed the women goodnight, and their weekend whiskers scratched the women's cheeks, the women did not think shave. They thought stay. Thanks.
Hey, so I'm a playwright, and this gave me a lot of anxiety. A lot of things give me anxiety, but normally I write for people to perform, and I did not get anyone to perform. So I'm going to read part of a solo piece that I have not performed for people, but here goes. So forgive me. And this is about, it's like a coming of age, it's like a 20-minute solo piece of sort of coming of age between these two teenagers these two boys who kind of fall in love through their love of like hip hop culture in the 80s. A bit of history. My mom and dad always wanted to be down. My grandparents were on some old Jew shit, half communist and half gangster. But my parents were on some soul food eating, jazz rocking, bebop talking, hang with the brothers and sisters all night in Harlem type shit when they were young. My dad even played in the jazz band. He was the drummer. Get it? Rhythm? And I don't think my mom had even thought about getting with a white guy till Dad came along, kicking his beatnik jazz actor moves in the West Village in the 60s. And that was their time when they were young, just like in their photos, thin, unlined, ungray, unfat, real kids, beautiful, happy, laughing, married. And then, I came along about a decade hence, and there were some good times, sure. I've seen pictures of those too. And then, the inevitable slumping into darkness occurred. Mom got crazy, Dad got drunk, Mom got depressed, Dad fucked around, Mom and Dad fight, and then just Mom. Just me and Mom and a little walk up downtown. Some cats, some records, and some of Dad's old drums. There's characters in this. Om. Mom? Om Shanti Shanti Om. What is that? What is that? Mommy is doing yoga. Sounds fucking weird. The thing is, at this time, just about all my friends also lived alone with their moms, while all the dads bounced around to Chile, to Germany, or to Soho to chill with Japanese architects. Whatever, just away from the long-haired white women in small apartments in the village. Women who had too many books, too many papers, who listened to yoga tapes, NPR, and smoked weed late at night. The dads were gone. It was what it was, plain and stable, like the way wallpaper is, or that sometimes the sky is white and sometimes it's cold when you wake up. See, the TV commercials for Star Wars action figures always had these real, clean little blonde kids playing in their massive backyards with like rivers and dikes and lakes in them. And while these young blonde children, who sported the entire fucking Star Wars collection, had extensive action figure battles that spanned fields of hay, the redwoods, and picnic tables, I had no idea where that was. I played with my figures in the snow, on top of radiators, between buildings, under the staircase, by the mailbox, and in my bath. I used to get real mad that my Luke Skywalker action figure, unlike the one on TV, could never hold his gun straight and would go to the side ineffective. I got so mad I even bit off his thumb. I was also mad that kids would come over to my house and then tease me for like 3 years about being served mozzarella cheese with mold on it, or out of glasses that had lipstick stains, or how when they left my house their jackets smelled like cat piss. And I was even more pissed that Dad sent me and Mom an alimony check for maybe $75 with our names written really big on the envelope in this stupid childlike handwriting. And if you wanted to get into it, you could say that Mom maybe wasn't doing so very hot these days, that she weighed maybe 90 pounds, and that guys with really deep voices and names like Adrian and Victor would call, and they'd go into her bedroom while I played Nintendo. But it's a small apartment, and the walls are thin and chipped, and the hush-hush, murmur is worse in a lot of ways than just saying, Mom is going out to do her thing, which of course she did. But we stuffed it up into our backpacks and zipped it off into morning. We stuffed ourselves into coats and put our chin under our zippers. I got the hell out of there as much as possible. I waited for friends in hallways. I went on walks. I went under covers. I read whole sci-fi novels. I looked for knights, for ninjas, for large alien ships that destroyed worlds, for dogs that talked, for robots, for death on a pale horse, for nature, for something. Then there was Nikki. Me and Nikki, both Nikki and me were chubby. We're in the back of class. This is 7th grade. First thing Nikki says to me is, "What up, boy?" What? "What up, boy?" The sky? "Boy, I'll smack your ass. I'll smack you in the head." "What?" "I'll fuck you up." "Oh, what?" "Boy!" Nikki was big on the boy. I mean big, really big. So that it popped up in just about every sentence except when the teacher called him in the back of the room. He wasn't so good at math, Nikki wasn't. Underneath the hood of his sweatshirt that he chewed the strings off of, Nikki chewed on his cheeks. His lower lips always shining from big, fat, wet lips. Nikki chewing all the time. Gums, pens, fingernails, his lips. He was a raw pink mess. There were some small toffee-colored stains around the ridge of the hood of his sweatshirt, and his eyes managed to be both light and beady at the same time, and his teeth were fucked up so bad, I assume that in later years he spent some deep time in braces, and his hands and necks were always streaked with dirt, but he and I did sit in the back, hunched over, welded to each other, going on about Public Enemy, BDP, the Raiders, and the fucked up kids at our school. Being with Nikki was like opening a can of something really cool. Mixtapes, gobstoppers, posters, fake blood, a German Shepherd, a VCR, some Eddie Murphy tapes, comics, tons of comics, porn, and something else. Something bouncy, round, and comforting. Big, he was big and loud. But it was the boy that really got me going. It was a mantra, a fire, a new way. That was key, like pushing over a fake wall into some long-lost basement dungeon and learning all this new shit. No more backpedaling, no more scrambling, like the wall in the pool, you could kick off of it. "Boy, what up, boy? What up, Nikki? Yo." Saliva out of the side of his mouth, chewing gum. He says to me, "Yo, come here, boy." "Why?" "Yo, check this shit out. You right?" "No." He shows me. "I'm Dune." "What's that?" "Dune, that's my tag." "What is that?" "You're gonna need one. You gotta get a tag." "Why?" "It looks fresh, right?" It changed the way I talked, the way I walked, the way I dressed, the way I went about just about everything. The music was important, but it was connected like a tooth to a whole lot more. Like my folks before me, I got down. I didn't compete with those kids on TV anymore. I didn't have to have a clean house. I didn't have to be skinny. I didn't have to like Bon Jovi or Aha. I got to cover the fat on my stomach comfortably with big black sweatshirts and blue baseball hats and listen to Chuck D and fucking KRS-One, and all the other idiots in our school didn't even know what we were on. They just knew we had big, colorful markers that could get you high if you smell them, and that Nikki could lickety-split make massive bubble letters flecked with yellow, orange, and blue. And straight up, we didn't care about skateboards and bowl haircuts and the rest of that white shit. Hi. I'm going to show the first 5 minutes of this movie I wrote, Hateship, Loveship, which is based on an Alice Munro short story, Hateship, Friendship, Courtship, Loveship, Marriage. And it came about because I'm sort of the luckiest person in the world, and that is my agent said, I want you to go meet with this producer, Dylan Sellers, and this was about 10 years ago. And I looked up Dylan Sellers, and I saw that he had produced Agent Cody Banks and the Agent Cody Banks sequel, and that he was working on a reboot of Footloose. And so I said to my agent, why am I taking this meeting? Because I don't like to write those kind of movies. And he said, just take this meeting. You'll like Dylan. He's a smart guy. And I did. And Dylan had read my first script that I wrote, and he really loved it. And he told me he wanted to make movies like that, not like Agent Cody Banks 3. And so he said, Mark, what are you reading these days? And I said, I've been reading a lot of Alice Munro. And he said, you're kidding me. And I said, no. And he said, my brother just gave me an Alice Munro book for Christmas. Should I read it? And I said, yes, you should. And then about a month later, he said, do you want to adapt one of the stories in her new collection? And at that time, it was this Hateship, Friendship, Courtship, Loveship, Marriage collection. And I said, boy, do I. And he got Warner Brothers to pay me to write this script. Now, this is a movie that Warner Brothers would never, ever make because it's actually about people. But he got them to pay me to do it. And through a bunch of miracles, it actually got made about 10 years later. And now it is in theaters and on demand. So I'm going to just play the first 5 minutes of it, and I wanted to talk one more thing, and that is to adapt an Alice Munro story is kind of weird because so much of her stories take place in the interiors of the characters, right? They're not heavily plot-driven, they're not dialogue-driven, they're not anything that you would normally think of a movie to be driven by. But the one thing that they all have, all of Alice Munro's stories have, is really well-drawn characters. And if my students will attest that that's where I think all good films come from, is character. Not plot, not premise, not setting, but character. And so it was actually a really easy adaptation for me because the characters were all there, especially the protagonist, Johanna. And the opening scene is a scene that I actually sort of got to make up based on her story. She's working for an older woman, and she's been taking care of her for about 15 years, so about a third of her life she spent taking care of this woman in the middle of nowhere. And the movie begins with, well, you'll see, okay? And my students will also attest that I am the biggest Luddite on the planet. I don't know I can't do anything technical, so bear with me, and let's hope that this works. The volume, okay. Can we turn off the lights too, or? Maybe. Yeah, is that good?
Joanna?
I'm here.
Yes. I'd like to wear my blue dress.
Yes, ma'am. Hi, yes, I'd like to report a death. Yes, ma'am. No, I don't know. She's very old. I take care of her. No, I work here. Yes, ma'am.
I hope it was peaceful.
I was in her sleep. Thank you.
So you got another job lined up there?
Yeah. Whole new everything. Mrs. Willett's pastor set it up.
Gorgeous.
Hey, Dad.
Hey, Edith.
Hi.
What's going on?
Because I think if you check that out,
Sure, you want to have this conversation.
it's a really good opportunity. I just thought you might be interested in it.
Why don't you just leave him alone?
It is a really good opportunity.
There's a lady over there.
I'm Johanna Perry from Plainfield. The pastor sent me.
Oh, yes, we've been expecting you. Only.
All right, that's it. Thanks for your help.
Anyone have any questions after all of that? Oh, if you do have questions, you have to use a microphone. That microphone is coming right now. Who wants to be the first one? Yes, sir.
Hello.
Hello.
Fantastic. This was fun. So my question to you, for any of you, is what is that bastard piece of writing that's still sitting there waiting to be done? I know you all have one.
Sam?
I was like, oh my God, thinking. What is that bastard piece of writing? You know, I wrote a play a few years ago that is really strange. A lot of people think it's really odd. It's not at all realistic. And I was like really excited about the style of it. And I just haven't found a home for it. So I've not really worked on it much after that. But so that's my particular.
But do you feel like it's done? I mean, you just haven't found a home.
No,
for, okay.
I don't feel like. I mean, I'm going to speak. I feel like nothing I ever write is ever done. Right? It gets done sometimes, as in is performed, and sometimes someone takes it away and is like, it's done. But I don't often, and I often have this other experience of reading things that I wrote 5 years ago and thinking that they're terrible, and wishing that I could rewrite them. So I don't know if that's a helpful answer to you, and this is just one person's experience. Anyone else? Crew?
I'm a poet, but I've been trying to write a novel badly for years, which I'll never finish. So I think you could call it a bastard. That'd be all right.
I have a novel that I've been working on for 8 years. I have a novel that I've been working on for 8 years that I've been that I thought I finished 3 years ago, and it's not finished. I hope someday to write another novel, but it's looking bleak.
The writer Chuck Palahniuk, who's very generous to other writers, author of Fight Club, Choke, many other amazing risky books, funny books. He told me he told me about a novel he was going to write. He did a lot of research on the subject, but he couldn't find anything funny about it. So ultimately, he cast it aside. But he said to me, based on the subject matter, mass murders, little-known mass murders, he said, I think you might like it. And he was so right. And so I did the research that Chuck had done before, and I'm very eager to write what won't be a novel. I don't do that. It'll be maybe a novella. But I'm very grateful to him for passing along the thing that wasn't funny to me. And I want to do it.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's nice to hear, you guys as professionals hearing your struggles as we all try to struggle with our own writing. So thank you.
Other questions?
So I might get the quote wrong, but I believe that Henry James was quoted earlier, and he said that every writer is a reader who has aspired to emulation. And I was just wondering, who were some of the writers who aspired you guys to emulation back in the day?
Sam?
Bret Johnston first. Yeah, that's an easier question to answer. I think for me, there's playwrights that sort of like the first time you hear like Led Zeppelin or something, like when you hear their dialogue the first time, it hits your ear unlike anything you've ever heard. And some obvious people for me are Anton Chekhov and Harold Pinter, Carol Churchill, David Mamet, and more recently someone who I had over here, Annie Baker. Like those are some I would just grab to you guys.
So when I was in college, I took a class very much like the class that I teach here, creative nonfiction. I was a student journalist. My idea of journalism was front page newspaper stories, and then I took this class and I was reading Joan Didion and John McPhee and Tracy Kidder and Norman Mailer and Tom Wolfe. And it was writers like those that really turned the lights on for me and made me realize that nonfiction narrative has all the possibility of short stories and fiction, the dramatic scene-by-scene urgency that you don't see in newspaper stories, but you do in writers like that. And it was a complete turning point for me.
I loved Jorie Graham's work, who's not here tonight, for just like the breakneck pace of it. It was so fast, and I remember when I read it the first time, I didn't really know that poems could move that quickly. She was just so speedy and terrifying. You felt like you had like vertigo by the end of those poems, and I just love that speed so much. But also, the sense of humor of a poet, Frank O'Hara, who I love a lot. And the sense that he could get just sort of anything into a poem. It didn't have to. Was sort of laboring under a false impression that things had to be poetic kind of in advance of the poem, so that my subject matter needed to be poetic. And I think Frank O'Hara taught me that poems could be kind of about anything. So Frank O'Hara is a big deal for me.
I looked to certain story writers who showed me characters that sounded like people speaking, not like a writer writing. And I certainly looked to Grace Paley, my beloved Grace Paley, Mary Robeson, brilliant. Well, she also is a novelist, but I read her stories first. She wrote stories first. Tilly Olson's stories, Leonard Michael's stories, the voices. Yeah, people speaking.
I didn't have an education anything close to what everyone in this room had, what every Harvard student had. I had a very bad education based on where I grew up. And so I kind of have two answers. One is that I never took any creative writing classes or anything like that. So most of the literature that I read and loved was kind of poetry. So I really loved Yeats. I really loved Keats. I really loved Elizabeth Bishop. I really loved those writers. But that, I wouldn't dream to emulate them. That never occurred to me. Where I grew up, reading and writing is there's no priority on it whatsoever. There still isn't to this day. And so it's this very complicated thing that in many ways I'm still trying to wrap my mind around, that I didn't really understand you could still be a writer. I mean, it sounds like a joke, but it's true. Like, I didn't understand you could do it in a somewhat sad, but in a complicated way. I thought all the books had been written. I really did. I didn't know that this was still a viable thing to do. So I always wanted to be a reader, far more than I wanted to be a writer. And then the other answer is that I did have a couple of wonderful teachers. One of them was a classics professor, and he just walked over to my desk one day. He knew that I really loved to read, and he knew that I was putting a lot of time into my essays, just these kind of literature papers. And he walked over and he put a ticket on my desk, and he said, "Go to that." And I didn't know what it was. And it was a reading by the novelist and short story writer Robert Stone. And I went there. Robert Stone was the first writer that I'd ever seen in my life. And so I went there knowing that I loved to read. I went there knowing that I loved to write. An hour later, after the reading, I knew that I wanted to write. I knew that there were still writers in the world, and I wanted to be one. I wanted to surround myself with these people, people in the audience. That's what I wanted. So I wanted to emulate Robert Stone, and I hadn't yet read a word of what he had written.
I had a similar experience to Bret in that I was a chemistry major as an undergrad, and then my senior year I switched to English, and so I had to take 5 English courses each semester to graduate on time, and I did it, but I didn't really understand that writing was kind of this living thing, that it was still happening at all. I mean, there were certainly some things I connected to, but they were kind of weird things and far-flung things, like the book of Marjorie Kemp, the first autobiography written in English. And then, you know, like in my American Lit of the 60s course, of course, I connected to, you know, Kerouac and all the other cliches. But when I got to graduate school, I took a fiction writing class. I went to graduate school not for fiction writing, but I took a fiction writing class. And that's when I was introduced to sort of living writers. And the first story that really hit me in the gut was a story I was talking to Amy about yesterday, The Legend of Pig Eye by Rick Bass. And it just sort of, it made me want to be a writer. It's that simple. It definitely, like, I read it and it made me want to write. And I think that lovely feeling of when you read something really good, or you read something that really speaks to you, when you see a film that really speaks to you, you should want to go home and write. And that was the first time it happened to me, and luckily enough, it has happened to me a lot since then. But yeah, I was a late bloomer. So.
Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
I was really happy to hear the reference to the ethnic personality. And when I look at Juno Diaz and Edwidge Danticat and Jamaica Kincaid and all these people, they talk about how the ethnic voice is what the public is hungry for. Can you comment on that? I mean, one person talked about it, but is that a rising trend that any of you are looking at participating in?
I'm going to try to answer. That's I'm going to stutter. For me, well, I love both those writers that you mentioned immensely, and I'm not really even a fiction writer, but Juno Diaz particularly, I think is a tremendous writer. But I think that for me, I try to work in the milieu of contemporary language and contemporary dialogue. I mean, that's what playwrights do. And so some of what you're talking about filters in there, but I haven't made a conscious effort to do it. It just sort of comes out in whatever the thing is that I'm interested in. And I'm interested in cities, and I'm interested in people, and I'm interested in the way people talk. So that's how that emerges generally. For me, that's it's a playwright's perspective though.
I don't think my mic is working anymore. Can y'all hear me? It's not. I'm not blind. You sure? We only rehearsed that one 5 times. I love all the work of the writers that you mentioned. Jamaica, we're lucky enough to have her on the creative writing faculty. Juno and Edwidge. I mean, I don't know the answer to the question of, are those voices and visions, what did you say, more on the rise or something like that? I don't know the answer to that. What I think of when I think of all of those writers' work is I think of the complexity of the characters. Like what Mark was saying about what draws him to a screenplay, is that all 3 of those writers give us characters that transcend the reading experience. They stay with us. They become our memories, and that's based on the nuance and I keep saying it, but the complexity of the characters. And all of those writers write about characters who are under great pressure and under great different kinds of pressure. And I think that tells us who they are as much as the ethnic, kind of qualities that you were talking about. So when I think of those writers, I think of their characters more than anything else, and that's why I love their work. So.
I just had a question about creative nonfiction, and so really, I'm just interested in all of your opinions on this. Memoir has become increasingly more popular, and there seems to be a lot of discussion about what represents truth, where's the line between fiction and nonfiction. Some creative nonfiction writers use reconstructed dialogue, composite characters, etc. Not to turn this into a symposium on that, but what are your thoughts on where those lines should be in creative nonfiction?
Yeah, so that's a big can of worms. I think it's a very complicated thing. With my classes, and one of the fun things about the way nonfiction is taught here at Harvard is that we throw the memoirists and the essayists and the narrative journalists in together, and the journalists learn from the self-reflection of the memoirists, and the memoirists learn the research skills from the journalists. But inevitably, this question of what is fair game for the nonfiction writer comes up because, in fact, memoirists, essayists, and narrative journalists, just to crudely divide nonfiction into those three categories, work along a totally different spectrum of not reliability so much, but accountability. You know, a narrative journalist is going to have to hew to the attributable facts in a way that we don't expect memoirists and essayists to hew. But more than that, in fact, in my class this evening, we were talking about this in memoir and how much a memoirist can permit himself or herself to go beyond what is consciously remembered. And I think that there's great latitude there, and that there are things that are stamped in our minds as iconic memories, and we may write about them. And then there are the memories that we come to in the act of writing, in the act of creating a scene from our past with details that might have not been originally available and may not be something that you can trace back. But I think that's fair game for the memoirist. And I think that permission that's been part of the memoir genre for 20 years now or so has just been part of the explosion of memoir as a literary form. It's welcomed the imagination into memoir writing.
Yes, ma'am.
Thanks. Amy mentioned the importance of voice in stories, and I know a lot of you had really dynamic voices in your readings. And I wonder how you develop the character's voice, if it comes to you or if it, becomes natural through drafts, and how do you know what dialogue to keep in a story and what to take out?
Amy?
Eavesdrop. You listen. What do people actually say when they talk to each other? I used to give an assignment sometimes where I would say to the students in my class, go eavesdrop and come back with a few overheard lines, don't tell us the context. And it was so interesting to see, in a way, how vague, like you couldn't tell. There was mystery. There's mystery to it. People don't talk the way some people think. You write them out. And it's really listening. It's listening. And I'm a big fan of many of the Southern writers writing today, and or who wrote recently. But, it's like Barry Hannah, the late Barry Hannah, who knew that certain folks in southern Mississippi don't say mother-in-law, they say mother-and-law. Because he listened, and well, he was from there, but he listened. And a Paget Powell character, a little girl, says, let's not tell mommy, let's let it be surprisey, not surprising. So it's that little, it's these eensy little things. It's not, go out and have a voice, find a voice. It's these little alterations and adjustments to regular speech that I like. But then there's voice, like Maybe you'd like to say a word, Sam.
Well, I mean, you know, I was thinking about what you're saying. I mean, I guess I would echo what Amy said. To me, I think eavesdropping is obviously a great exercise, but to me, it's about detail of voice. You know, playwrights have to traffic, and all writers, screenwriters and fiction writers, have to traffic in dialogue that reflects their style. Like, so just to use an obvious example, like someone like a Harold Pinter play is going to sound really different than someone in a Edward Albee play, right? And neither is more realistic, right? I think when you're at the better you get as a writer, the more people can say like, oh, that's a Sam Marks play, right? If you become your own genre of dialogue, that's when I think you're really hitting. And that has nothing to do with, for me, realism. It has to do with specificity and sound, which is, I guess, a way to say voice. But that's, I don't know. And, you know, keep searching. And you know, and when stuck, I just like, will just take someone from my life and just put them on stage. Which speaks to what you're talking about with nonfiction. Like, I feel like every play I do, I betray someone dear to me. And and they can't ever see it.
I mean, the only thing I would add to that is I think voice, for me, I think it comes down to obsession. I'm really I'm interested in obsession in fiction. What are the characters obsessed with? There's a term, I don't know if y'all are familiar with it, inattentional blindness. It's when you're focused on whatever's right in front of you that you go blind to everything on the side. I'm interested in seeing and hearing characters who are unintentionally blind to everything except what they've become obsessed with. And how does that manifest itself in the voice? That's what I think of when I think of voice. I mean, clearly something like Lolita, light of my life, fire my loins, my sin, my soul, the tongue takes a trip to tap at the back of the teeth on 3. I mean, that's... you know what he's obsessed with, you know, and that's obviously the most extreme example we could come up with, but it's instructive, you know. Maybe have time for 1 or 2 last questions. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, so I am taking a class this semester called Sonic Ethnography, and we're kind of given permission to go out and record sounds, and we learned how to edit them and kind of put things together. And it's been interesting for me, coming from a poetry background as a person who's really interested in language, kind of colliding with people in the anthropology department who are really fascinated by background noises and the kind of extra human stuff of space that we hear around us. So kind of in the editing process, in like sort of reconciling my vision with theirs, come up with kind of when you're listening to a piece, what questions does this piece make you ask? And I think that that's something that would be interesting to think about in terms of writing and what maybe you guys are working on right now. So if it's not too hard of a question, what are the questions that are motivating you right now to write?
Yeah. I have to make some up real quick. Can somebody go first?
How can I get money?
One of the questions that always interests me is, what is enough of many things? When do you have enough love? When do you have enough happiness? When do you have enough purpose? And I certainly go along with Bret's feeling for obsession, the importance of obsession. I worked with somebody who used to say, "Oh, the 3 things you want in fiction, and obsession, nerve, ground worth reporting on, something worth talking about. Nerve, you can't teach nerve, you can encourage it, but obsession." What is it that you can't stop thinking about or talking about, even if you want to? That's a question that interests me a lot, always.
I guess the questions that I thinking about as a writer are more about form. As a nonfiction writer, whether you're working as a journalist or a memoirist, you have a block of material, and it may be from your life, from memory, or it may be from observation out there in the world with a notebook in your hand. And the things that excite me and challenge me and flummox me and vex me are about form, about how to take that strip of experience and figure out the best possible sequence of narration for it. Does it move along chronologically? Forward in time? Does it start at the end of the story and loop back? And to keep reading, whenever I'm writing nonfiction, I'm always reading fiction, because the fiction writers have invented so many wonderful forms, and we can get, as nonfiction writers, so many great ideas for how to process and mediate experience, again, either journalistically acquired or memoiristically acquired. But it's form, I think, that I'm obsessed with these days.
I actually have a real answer. And, I mean, not that theirs were fake, but it has nothing to do with money. I think, because I actually was thinking about it a lot since you asked it. So in the last minute and a half, I was thinking, pretty much everything I write starts with a character, like screenplay, fiction, novel, short story, whatever. It starts with a character. So I think the question that I'm always asking is, like, what is the character's story? Like, that's it. I mean, I know the character before I know the story, if that makes any sense. And so that's my answer.
Yeah, and I didn't mean to be flippant about that question too, Debbie. I'm always nervous about actually knowing what it is too clearly. So as soon as you ask that question, I start to panic a little bit. Like I don't want to find out what it is on this stage and then not be interested in it anymore. So I sort of, and then once, I think that I would have a better chance of saying what I was interested in the last stuff that I wrote, except I don't want to read it, so I also can't kind of really learn from that either. So there's something about kind of being unconscious for me in the moment of the composition that's really important. So it's hard for me to say what specifically things are.
Yeah. I once had a writing teacher who said, you can't teach anyone to become a better writer, but you can teach them to get closer to their obsessions, which is sort of like, and sort of like what Darcy, I find myself writing about things that I can't stop thinking about. Right. And that's weird stuff that I'm not even going to talk about. No, I mean, it's just like, it's just weird. It's just like, and it just won't leave my head for like 6 months or a year. And then I'm like, I guess I better write a play. But then the thing is, when I write it, and this is my own issue, is ultimately ends up being sort of about the same thing again and again. You know, that's just but like, I feel like your personal obsessions emerge. You know, I could write a play about spacemen, and it wouldn't be that different than the thing you heard. You know, it would just, they just come out eventually. But that's my own, but that's my take on it.
Yeah, I think I have two answers. One is almost exactly what Sam said, which is, what can you not write? What do you have to write? I think that's probably the question. On a more kind of project by project basis, I'm interested in where characters take shelter, and I'm interested in what happens when that shelter fails. I think that's what I'm always interested in. What happens when the storm comes and the shingles come off the house? What do we do then? That's I think I'll always be interested in that. How much can people take and still survive? Anything else? Thank you very much for giving us this opportunity.